Hello friends, welcome to my channel The Inside Table. Today, we bring you a Hollywood story that unfolded live on television and left everyone watching in tears. This was not just another interview, but a moment so powerful that it touched the hearts of people in the studio and millions of viewers at home. June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Most of America was commemorating the event with parades, ceremonies, and presidential speeches. But in Studio One in Burbank, California, The Tonight Show was doing what it did best, making people laugh and forget their troubles for an hour. Johnny Carson was in the middle of a comedy bit about the new fitness craze, sweeping America. He was demonstrating ridiculous exercise equipment with his trademark physical comedy, getting laughs from the studio audience of 325 million viewers watching at home. Ed McMahon was doing his booming laugh at the desk. Doc Severinsen and the band were waiting for their musical cue. Everything was running exactly as scripted. Johnny had mentioned D-Day earlier in his monologue, a brief acknowledgement that today marked 40 years since the Normandy invasion. It was a respectful nod, the kind of historical reference he'd make before moving on to lighter material. He told a gentle joke about his own father being too old to serve in World War II, then transitioned smoothly into his prepared comedy segments. The audience had appreciated the moment of recognition before diving back into entertainment. Nobody expected what happened next. In the third row of the studio audience, in seat 14, sat a man named Walter Bankfra. He was 94 years old, though he looked older. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind and memory. He wore a suit that had been expensive once, but was now slightly too large for his diminished frame. On his lapel was a small pin that most people wouldn't recognize, the insignia of the 29th Infantry Division. Walter had been brought to the taping by his granddaughter Sarah, who'd won the tickets through a radio contest. She'd thought it would be good for him to get out of the house to do something besides sit in his chair and stare at old photographs. Walter had resisted at first, said he didn't much care for television, but Sarah had insisted. "It'll be fun, Grandpa," she'd said. Johnny Carson makes everyone laugh, but Walter wasn't laughing. He'd been sitting silently through the entire show, his hands folded in his lap, his expression distant. When Johnny mentioned D-Day, Sarah felt her grandfather's body go rigid beside her. She glanced at him and saw his jaw clenching. His eyes suddenly focused on something far beyond the studio walls. "Grandpa, are you okay?" she whispered. Walter didn't answer. He was somewhere else now. Somewhere Sarah couldn't follow. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The ramp of a Higgins boat dropping. The sound of machine gun fire. The screams of boys who would never become men. Johnny finished his exercise equipment. Bitten was transitioning to his next segment when Walter Bancroft stood up. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't leap to his feet or shout. He simply rose slowly from his seat. His movements careful and deliberate. The way very old people move when their bodies remember being young. He raised his right hand, not high, just shoulder level, the way a child raises their hand in school. The audience members around him noticed first. They turned to look at this elderly man standing in the middle of a comedy show. Some thought he was confused, maybe needed help finding the restroom. Others thought it might be a planned bit, one of those audience participation moments that talk shows sometimes staged. But Sarah knew better. She knew the look on her grandfather's face. She'd seen it before on the rare occasions when he talked about the war. It was the look of a man carrying something too heavy to hold alone anymore. "Grandpa, sit down," she whispered urgently, tugging gently at his sleeve. Please, you're going to get us kicked out. Walter didn't sit down. He kept his hand raised, his eyes fixed on Johnny Carson. On stage, Johnny was in mid-sentence when he noticed the disruption. A studio security guard was already moving up the aisle toward row 3, ready to politely escort the confused elderly man out of the taping. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes audience members had medical emergencies or got disoriented. It was handled quietly and professionally. But something made Johnny stop talking. Maybe it was the way the old man stood, rigid and formal like a soldier at attention. Maybe it was the pin on his lapel, barely visible from the stage, but somehow significant. Maybe it was just instinct, that indefinable quality that had made Johnny Carson the best at what he did for 3 decades. "Wait," Johnny said, holding up his hand to the security guard. His voice carried across the studio firm and clear. "Hold on a second." The guard stopped. The audience fell silent. Ed McMahon leaned forward at his desk, uncertain what was happening. The camera operators kept filming, trained to capture everything. Johnny walked to the edge of the stage, squinting slightly to see into the audience. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle now. "Did you want to say something?" Walter Bancroft stood there in the third row, his hands still raised, and for a long moment he didn't speak. The studio waited. 300 people in the audience, millions at home, all suspended in a moment that wasn't supposed to happen. When Walter finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of 40 years. "Mr. Carson," he said, "you mentioned D-Day earlier. You made a joke and moved on, and that's fine. That's what people do. But I was there." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop. Johnny's expression changed. The performer's mask slipping away to reveal genuine attention. "You were at Normandy?" he asked quietly. "Omaha Beach," Walter said. "First wave 0630 hours, June 6, 1944. Johnny didn't hesitate. "Come down here," he said, gesturing to the stage. "Please come talk to me." The security guard moved aside as Walter made his way down the aisle. It took time. His granddaughter tried to help him, but he waved her off gently. "I can walk," he said. "I walked off that beach. I can walk down these stairs." The audience watched in complete silence as this 94-year-old veteran made his way to the stage. His movements were slow but dignified. Every step seemed to carry its own weight of memory. Johnny met him at the stage steps, offering his hand to help Walter up. For a moment, the two men stood there together, and Johnny seemed to understand that something extraordinary was about to happen. "What's your name, sir?" Johnny asked. "Walter Bancroft, Private First Class, 29th Infantry Division." Johnny guided Walter to the guest couch, the same couch where movie stars and politicians had sat for thousands of interviews. But this felt different. The studio light seemed softer somehow. The cameras, usually intrusive, felt respectful. Johnny sat down next to Walter, not behind his desk where he usually conducted interviews, but right beside him on the couch. Two men, two generations, separated by 40 years in a gulf of experience that most people couldn't imagine. "Walter," Johnny said quietly. "You said you were in the first wave at Omaha Beach." "Yes, sir." That was. Johnny paused, searching for words that felt adequate and finding none. "That was the worst of it, wasn't it?" Walter looked at Johnny and his eyes held something ancient and terrible. "Mr. Carson, I was in a Higgins boat with 31 other boys. Most of us were 18, 19 years old. We'd trained together, ate together, wrote letters home together. When that ramp dropped, we were supposed to run onto the beach and take cover behind the tank obstacles. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. The Germans had machine guns in the cliffs, Walter continued, his voice steady, but distant, as if he was reading from a script written in blood 40 years ago. They'd zeroed in on the exact spot where the ramps would drop. They'd practiced, they knew. Johnny didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just listened. I was in the back of the boat, Walter said. The ramp dropped and the boys in front started running. I heard the machine guns before I saw them. It sounded like firecrackers, hundreds of them all at once. The boys in front of me fell. Just fell like someone cut their strings. Ed McMahon was crying openly at his desk. The camera operators were crying. The audience sat frozen, barely breathing. I stepped over their bodies and ran. Walter said, I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just did it. I made it to a tank obstacle and laid behind it in the water. I was wounded, but I didn't know it yet. Adrenaline is a hell of a thing. Walter stopped talking for a moment. His hands were shaking now, not from age, but from memory. How many? Johnny asked softly. How many from your boat made it off the beach? Walter looked at him, and the pain in his eyes was bottomless. 6, he said. Out of 32. 6 of us survived the day. The number hung in the air like a ghost. 6 boys, 26 families who got telegrams, 26 futures erased in minutes. Johnny reached over and put his hand on Walter's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight of respect and sorrow that no words could express. Walter, Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. Why did you stand up tonight? Why now after 40 years? Walter was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But in that silent studio, every word was heard clearly. Because I've carried something for 40 years, Mr. Carson, and I'm 94 years old now. I don't have much time left. And I realized tonight listening to you make jokes and watching people laugh that I needed to say it out loud before I die. Say what, Walter? Walter Bancroft looked directly into the camera as if he could see through it to every person watching at home. His voice was steady now, clear and strong despite his age. My friends never came home. I did. 5 words. That's all it was. 5 words that contained 40 years of survivor's guilt. 40 years of waking up wondering why he got to grow old when 26 boys never got to grow up. 40 years of living a life that belonged to ghosts. The silence that followed was total. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition of a truth so profound that any response would diminish it. Johnny Carson sat there next to Walter Bancroft, and for the first time in 30 years of television, he had no words. His face was wet with tears. His composure, that legendary Carson control, was completely gone. And then Johnny did something unprecedented. He stood up and without saying a word, he pulled Walter into an embrace. The two men stood there on the Tonight Show stage under the lights in front of the cameras and they held each other. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, and Walter Bancroft, the last survivor of Boat Crew B7, Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. They stayed like that for 90 seconds. No one spoke. No one moved. The director didn't cut to commercial. The band didn't play. 300 people in the studio audience and 25 million watching at home simply witnessed two human beings connecting across a chasm of experience and generation. When they finally pulled apart, Johnny turned to the camera and said just 2 words. "We'll wait." And they did. For 3 full minutes. The Tonight Show stayed on air in complete silence. The camera held on Johnny and Walter sitting together on the couch, not speaking, just present. It was the longest unscripted silence in television history. Finally, Johnny looked at Walter. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for reminding us that some things are more important than laughter." Walter nodded. "I didn't tell you this for thanks, Mr. Carson. I told you because those boys deserve to be remembered. Not as numbers, not as casualties, as people. They had names. They had families. They mattered." "Will you tell us their names?" Johnny asked. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were worn thin. He opened it carefully. "William Anderson, Thomas Brennan, Robert Chen, Joseph Diageo. No relation to the baseball player. We used to joke about that. Frank Icento, George Flynn." Walter read all 26 names. It took almost 4 minutes. Johnny sat beside him, silent and attentive. The audience listened to a roll call of the dead boys who died 40 years ago on a beach in France, being remembered on live television by the last man who'd stood beside them. When Walter finished reading the names, he carefully folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "I've carried this list for 40 years, he said. "I read it every night before I sleep so I don't forget, so they don't become just a number." Johnny looked at Walter, and when he spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised everyone who knew him. "Walter, I want to do something with your permission." "What's that?" "I want to make sure those names are never forgotten. I want to create a memorial, something permanent that honors those 26 boys and every other soldier who didn't come home." Walter looked at Johnny with an expression of profound gratitude. "Mr. Carson, they'd already be forgotten if people like you didn't care. But yes, I'd like that very much." Johnny turned to the camera. "If anyone watching knows these families, if anyone has information about these 26 men, please contact NBC. We're going to tell their stories. We're going to make sure their sacrifice isn't reduced to a statistic." The response was overwhelming. Within 24 hours, NBC had received over 50,000 calls. Families of the fallen soldiers reached out, some learning for the first time exactly what happened to their fathers and uncles and brothers. Historians provided context. Veterans who'd served in other units at Normandy shared their own stories. Johnny Carson didn't just make a promise on television. He kept it. He funded the creation of the Walter Bancroft Memorial Wall, a permanent installation at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Listing not just the names of Walter's fallen comrades, but the names of every soldier in the first wave at Omaha Beach. Walter Bancroft lived for 18 more months after his appearance on The Tonight Show. He died peacefully in his sleep on December 12, 1985, holding the list of names he'd carried for 41 years. His granddaughter Sarah found it in his hand when she came to check on him the next morning. Johnny Carson attended Walter's funeral just as he'd attended Eleanor Patterson's. Again, no cameras, no press, just a man honoring someone who taught him something important. At the service, Johnny was asked to say a few words. He stood at the pulpit and looked at the small gathering of family and fellow veterans. "Walter Bancroft stood up in my studio on June 6, 1984, and he reminded all of us that freedom isn't free. That our comfortable lives were bought with the sacrifice of boys who never got to become men. He carried the weight of 26 ghosts for 40 years, not because he had to, but because he loved them, because they were his brothers. That's the kind of man Walter Bancroft was. The moment on The Tonight Show became legendary, not because it was entertaining, but because it was real. In an era of increasing cynicism and media manipulation, here was an unscripted moment of genuine human connection and historical weight. Television critics called it the most important moment in late-night television history. Not the funniest, not the most clever, the most important. In 1992, during Johnny's final episode of The Tonight Show, a group of World War II veterans attended the taping. When Johnny made his final appearance, they stood as one and saluted. Johnny returned the salute, and those who knew the story understood it was for Walter Bancroft. June 6, 1984 started as a comedy show. It became something else entirely. It became a reminder that behind every statistic is a story. Behind every number is a name, and behind every name is a life that mattered. Walter Bancroft stood up in a comedy show to speak for the dead. Johnny Carson stopped the show to listen, and for 3 minutes, America remembered that some silences are more powerful than any words. The list of 26 names that Walter carried for 40 years is now engraved in bronze in New Orleans. Visitors stop to read them, to touch them, to remember. And every June 6, a ceremony is held where all 26 names are read aloud, just as Walter read them on The Tonight Show. They never came home, but they were never forgotten because one old man had the courage to stand up and speak, and one television host had the wisdom to